Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another one of our member webinar series. Thank you for joining us. My name is Bill Cunningham, and I'm the Vice President of Community Business and Real Estate here at Van City. Before we begin, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. I am coming to you today from the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, and in particular the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. We give thanks to those that have taken care of this land for countless generations. And I encourage you to acknowledge the territories that you're watching this video from in your own way. Throughout the webinar today, if you've got questions or things that you want to pose to our guest speaker, we encourage you to make use of the Q&A function here on Teams. We will be collating the questions throughout the presentation and in the Q&A session, getting to just as many as we can. And now, let's get started. We are very pleased to be joined today by Ron Wolsham. He's a Senior Manager at MNP Cybersecurity Services in BC. He works out of their Victoria office and helps a broad range of organizations assess and improve their cybersecurity. With over 25 years experience advising on security strategies in the public sector, insurance, financial, e-commerce, and retail sectors, including providing services ranging from auditor to assisting with remediation activities where required for both small and very large organizations. He has very deep and intimate knowledge of today's topic. Clearly, when it comes to cybersecurity, Ron is the kind of expert we would all want in our corner. Ron, over to you.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Bill. So we have a few things to cover today. We'll get to the next slide. So what's actually happening out there in the cybersecurity world? With COVID, one of the challenges has been that the cyber attacks that we normally were hearing about 2.5 years ago faded into the distance, and we really haven't heard a lot of what's going on other than the bigger companies being breached and attacked lately. But what's really happening is that attacks are against anybody that has an IP address today on the internet. So it can be a small business, large business, and all different sectors of the business areas. What we do know, though, is larger organizations have the deeper pockets. They have the skill, required people to defend against those attacks, but smaller organizations rarely make the news, but the impacts on those smaller organizations are much more devastating. Next. So this slide is actually information coming from CIRA, which is the Canadian Internet Registration Authority, and these three topics, we're going to cover a little bit later in this presentation, but I thought the findings were very pertinent. This is only Canadian information. Usually we're given American information in statistics, but this is strictly Canadian. So when they did their review, they found that 71% of companies actually didn't have a formal patching policy. And not having a patching policy for computers, workstations, servers, firewalls, even cell phones that are part of an organization, that can expose a company to very large security holes that can be used to compromise a company's internal networks. They also found that 37% of the companies didn't have anti-malware installed. So normally we hear about antivirus being installed, but anti-malware is a little bit different. It actually does scans looking for things like ransomware, malicious applications, those kind of things. And then probably the major problem today from most businesses is that they found only 54% of smaller businesses provide cybersecurity training for their employees. So these are things like recognizing a phishing attack, in-person attack, these sort of things. But without having proper training for your employees, that can lead to a lot of issues because employees are actually the first line of defense against cyber attacks. Next. So one of the things that parallel to this is when they talked about, like when you look at the phishing attacks and the different kind of attacks with ransomware over the last while, the key point in this slide is really that, back in February of 2020, there were really only about 5,000 attacks happening per week. And then by April, it had risen to over 200,000 per week. And one of the main reasons there was actually COVID, because with a lot of companies adopting work from home, it increased the risk that an employee could actually maliciously fall or, accidentally fall for a malicious email, click it, download malware, ransomware, these kind of things. But it just goes to show that, even in this past July, the number of attacks has just increased exponentially. Next. So I usually talk a little bit about the dark web, because what I've found in presentations is a lot of people have heard of the dark web, but they don't actually understand what it is and how it's used. And the dark web is actually basically the shopping mall for the bad guys, where when things are stolen, whether it's identity, whether it's artwork, these kind of things, they need a place to sell it. So this is where the dark web comes in. Next. So the internet's actually made up of 3 different layers. The top level is what's called the surface web. And the surface web is anywhere where you see an actual name. So that would be a facebook.com, gmail.com, gmail.ca. Those are all considered surface web, and they're fairly easy to find. Surface web really only makes up about 4% of the internet's global traffic, which is pretty amazing when you think about how much traffic's actually going through these different products. Underneath the surface web, there's actually what's called the deep web, and the deep web doesn't use naming conventions. So like vancity.ca, the deep web would use IP addresses to communicate between. So it would be like a 172 ... something address. And the deep web's where a lot of organizations do more what's called business to business. So that's areas like transferring medical records, financial records, all of these kind of things. That's accomplished down in the deep web. And beneath the deep web, there's actually what's called the dark web. And the dark web is very interesting because it was actually built by the US military to allow their spies to communicate between countries. So they could be in a country where they were operating as a spy and they wanted to send information back to the United States. They would use the dark web and a specific browser that's known as the Tor browser. It's also known as the Onion router. And what makes this a lot different is the dark web. When you move between different websites in the dark web, it will re-encrypt your traffic. So when it jumps from computer to computer, it's always re-encrypting itself and it's dropping its tail. And the reason it does that is because it makes everybody, basically hidden. It's very difficult to determine who the people actually are that are accessing the dark web and either buying things or selling things. And even though we had some success a couple of years ago shutting down some of the largest dark webs out there, they have grown back almost stronger than they were before, because there's actually a business need in the underground for that sales site. Next. One of the most famous dark websites in history, and there's actually a Netflix movie called The Silk Road, and it goes through the history of this website in particular, the Silk Road. And in this one, it may not be that clear, but when you look at the top left, there's 484 different drugs for sale. So what can happen is the dark web is by using the Tor browser, you could get to the Silk Road. You could actually buy any of these things listed here using Bitcoin and then have it shipped directly to your location of choosing. And it took about a good 5 years before the FBI was actually able to shut down the Silk Road. And they only did it because one of the key persons that was running it accidentally used his surface web email address in a conversation. And out of the hundreds of thousands of items that the FBI had obtained, that single use of a public email address allowed them to catch the person that was actually responsible for the Silk Road. But it did take a long time to do that. Next. So within the dark web, this is actually from the recent RSA conference. What are things worth in the dark web? So I steal your Facebook credential, so I steal your credit card number or your email. What can I sell them as a bad actor to somebody else? And as you can see, like Facebook accounts, they go for $1 because they're so often stolen, they're not really worth that much money. Credit cards, on the other hand, range between $5 and $15. And these are actually live credit cards. They'll actually go test the cards to make sure they're actually valid cards before they sell them. And usually what happens is they'll buy a sample of, 20 cards. The bad guy that's buying them will try them and see if they work. And if they work, then they'll buy the entire lot of credit cards. And that could be 100,000, credit cards at a time. The most expensive credential that you can buy in the dark web is actually email access. And the reason for that is because it's a lot simpler if you can break into a CFO, a CEO, or board member's email accounts and read what's happening in the company versus trying to break in and trying to go through it the long way around. So, again, when I mentioned, your people are your front line of defense, the email and, the loss of passwords, which I'll speak to shortly, it's very, very, critical that you don't let that happen, because if it does, it could compromise a company severely. Next. So how do they do things? Today, about 95% of all the attacks are actually through social engineering, and social engineering can be a whole lot of different ways. It means, it's become a very wide topic. It can range from anybody coming up to a front counter claiming they're from, a company, they're there to service equipment. They have all the fake credentials created, the business card, the jacket with the logo. It can be as simple as somebody coming in. It can be someone dropping USB sticks in a hallway or leaving them on a receptionist desk. And if you plug those into a computer, obviously that could be a real problem. We'll go to the next slide here. One of the things I noticed recently, kind of related to the dark web and also with the emails, is that the cyber criminals are actually offering to sell fake Canadian COVID-19 vaccination certificates online. So hopefully with the federal, program with the app to go on your phone, that'll make things a little bit better. But, one of the things that they are going after these days, and you can find, these certificates on the dark web, and you can even get them custom made with the different images that they provide, but it is becoming a bit of a problem. Again, there's a business need because people don't want to get COVID, or the shots, but they want to be able to access services like restaurants. So this has become a bit of a problem as well lately. Next. So the predominant way of social engineering today is really through phishing, and phishing is just, basically deception designed to make you do something that you probably shouldn't do. Next. This is kind of an interesting one recently. This was done through a phishing scam where people were basically sending out emails saying, we know you invest in Bitcoin, you should invest with us. We're such and such company. It's a great return. And a teenager was actually in the United States was actually able to rake in over $2.74 million worth of Bitcoin just by simply sending out emails to people saying, hey, I'll sell you this, send me Bitcoin to this account. And obviously a lot of people fell for it. And, Art Cooper's a predominant guy in the US in cybersecurity. And I just laughed because, his comment was, how does he lure people? Naked pictures, dollar signs, humans are so easy to troll. And that's why really phishing is the predominant challenge today, because phishing is what ultimately leads to ransomware, other kinds of applications that shouldn't be getting into your computer network. And this is predominantly how they do it today. So next page. To give you kind of an example, even with MNP, we have very good mail filters on our systems, but apparently it's not only the people in Nigeria that have millions of dollars to give away, but in this case, somebody reached out and tried to give me $1 million from Ireland, which was great. But again, you can see even in the best case, these emails do get through, and it ends up being your users, your employees that are the defense line against this. So if you don't do, phishing exercises to test your employees, determine how vulnerable you are, that can be a challenge to a company. And there's also different ways that they attack you through phishing. So on the left there's two sort of common terms. One is spear phishing, which is when they go after a very specific person in an organization. One of the key areas that people are usually surprised by is they actually go after your HR people, because if they can breach your HR's resources, emails, they can read everything that's going on about people. They can usually get an org chart to determine who does what in your organization. So again, spear phishing against those kind of targeted people. Accounts payable is another area. These are the key people that need to really be secure and be careful when they're opening emails. Whaling is a term that is really going after the big fish. So that's looking at going after the C-suite, going after board members, owners of organizations. And it does get very interesting here because they're very sophisticated. They will actually hire people to do research on individuals, say the CFO on a company. They will sit in Starbucks, research everything about that person. One of the ones I've seen is that they find out their child plays hockey, and then they research the hockey association. They find out that an email will be sent shortly describing a new code of ethics, and that's when the bad actors will use that and then create a phony email from the hockey association to that individual saying, click here or download this PDF with our new code of conduct. And unfortunately, that's going to lead to a compromise. So they are very good. They're very well funded now. It's become much more based on organized crime, where they set up shops to do the research. They set up shops to develop ransomware, develop the phishing emails, all of these kind of things. And they even have call centers where you can negotiate a ransom. Next. So with phishing, what are the common things that actually are happening? What do we see out there? It's actually changed a lot in the last 3 years, because 3 years ago, we used to warn everybody, don't click the attachment in the email because that's malware. And today that really only represents about 9% of the actual phishing attacks. What's really taken over is embedded links in an email. So for more information, click here, and that link without proper, antivirus, anti-malware could potentially load malware directly into that person's workstation. The other method that it's a little less used, but it's definitely gaining traction, is data entry, asking people to enter information into a fake website. And I'll give you a really good example shortly of how we do it at MNP when we attack companies. Obviously, is the white hatter. Most often used themes has changed, obviously, again with COVID, because so many people working remote. We see a lot of Microsoft Teams requests to join. Click here, to add me. And then, of course, coronavirus advisory alerts and health warnings. The other one, because most organizations have gone from standalone email in their offices and email services, and they've moved to Office 365. We see a very large increase in emails directed, stating that your Office 365 password's about to expire. Click here to, renew it and change it. So those are kind of the topics or the phishing templates that we see the most of these days. Next. So this is a little bit of behind the scenes. This is what we do as a cyber company. We're hired to basically evaluate companies' phishing. their ability to respond, defend against a phishing attack. So in this case, what happens is we'll work with an organization, usually with the IT department. We'll get a list of the emails that we want to go, attack. And basically we used scenarios like this one where, a company states we've reviewed our security policies. We're concerned about, our password strengths, if everybody's meeting the, our policy. So please click here to test it. And by the way, your character should, should have characters, should have one capital letter, et cetera, et cetera. So this email would be usually sent out at the beginning of the week, Monday or Tuesday, and then we would send another one afterwards, usually Thursday, early morning Friday, and that one would be more urgent. And it would say, if you haven't done this, please do it immediately. We have to report results to our executive early next week. And we usually found a split in people that fell for this. 50% kind of fell for it right away, and other people fell for it, later in the week. And we actually did have people that fell for it twice. They tested their password on Tuesday, tested it again on Thursday, and gave us their passwords both times. Next. So when you click that link on the previous page, what it actually takes you to in our world is a password checker. So, some of the key things that you should notice here is that use of the Intel logo. That's a very old logo that hasn't been used for years. And this actually is a page that Intel had years and years ago, but we've just reused it. So basically what we do is we ask you to type in your password. So we know who you are because you've responded through the email, so we know your email address. And if you type in your password, basically what happens is it says it's all good, great, carry on, no issues. But as you'll see on the next page, there's huge issues here, because in one scenario that we did in the past year, we targeted about 500 employees in an organization. So again, we sent the 2 emails. It was targeted for this, test your password, sent the second follow-up. Our results were that 51% of those employees, so 250 plus a few, actually clicked that link. So as I said in the previous page, that can be a big problem, because just clicking the link can download malware like ransomware immediately. What was a bit more astounding was 32% of this company's employees actually gave us their passwords. So we had the passwords for 32% of the company at that point. So, this was a stop moment. So we didn't actually wait to provide the final report. We had a call with their senior executive and said, you have a really big hole. Your front door is wide open. People are not paying attention. Obviously you need some training for your employees. Next. This is a great site. Be forewarned, when you spell Pwned, it is Pwned. So basically what this website does is it's amalgamated all of the data breaches that have happened in the last 10, 15 years and created a database of the emails that have been compromised. So what you can do on this site, and it's actually called Have I Been Pwned, .com, you can actually enter your email address and click Pwned, and it will actually tell you how many breaches. So this is a very old password or email address that I used to use with shaw.ca, and it shows at the bottom that shaw.ca account, my email, was actually exposed in 7 different data breaches, which is a little bit scary. Next slide. One of those breaches, everybody probably remembers when LinkedIn was breached about 2 years ago, made the national news everywhere. It's probably closer to 3 years now. But it made the news because, it was one of the first large-scale breaches of confidential data. But in the original breach, they actually lost very little information. This actually was a second breach that happened in the first half of 2021, so very recent. But if you look at the bottom there, the compromised data included everything from job titles, names, social media profiles, gender, everything. So this one actually lost a lot more information. So again, you don't want to, be losing those kind of that information on these third parties, because it could impact your other life. One of the predominant ones is if they can get emails on a third party. Obviously, if you're using them for multiple accounts, whether it's BC Hydro, Terrazin, Gas, these kind of websites, a lot of people still do use one password for everything, and that's absolutely the worst thing that you can be doing. Next. So why is the phishing so important? The main reason is that 98% of phishing is the avenue that leads to ransomware. And ransomware is basically the #1 online threat today against organizations. Unfortunately, we still hear very little of it. Smaller organizations rarely report that they've gone through a ransomware event. There's little requirements to do that. Under federal law, you are required to report attacks, especially if you lose data, but it still rarely happens. And also, gangs have moved into what's called post-intrusion ransomware. So this is secondary attack. So they may actually attack you, with ransomware. You pay it or you rebuild. But if you pay it, they may have left little tidbits behind that will reactivate a different malware later. So it's really important, if you do go through a ransomware attack, you clean your systems. Next. One of the big things kind of in the recent news, which was right in October, and they are starting to gain much more a national focus on this. So Biden has actually, convened 30 countries to start to try to crack down on the ransomware threat, because Homeland Security in the States has basically identified it now as a major threat to the US economy. So it's not just small companies that bear the brunt of a ransomware attack, but actually entire countries can have a major problem, especially when they attack things like supply chain. We know about the pipeline down in the south. We know about the meat packing plant. All of those were stopped dead, mainly because it was a supply chain attack. They attacked one cog within the process flow, and by impacting that one organization, they were able to impact everybody else. Next. So what's changing with ransomware? This is kind of an interesting thing that's been happening, and I kind of question, the threat actors' business model, because this is not the best way to do things. If you look at the right, 2% of the organizations in 2019 were actually asked for additional ransomware. So this means, you were attacked, you got ransomware, you paid the ransom. Normally the business model is you get the keys and you decrypt your computers and fix them and you go along, because it's just a cost of business almost at this point. But what's happened now is that if you look at the left, in 2020, 32% of those companies are holding, or the threat actors are holding companies, ransom. They're actually getting paid, whether it's 40,000 on the first payment, but then they're coming back and actually asking for even more money. And this actually wrecks the business model, because if people start realizing that they pay once and they may have to pay again and again, they may just not pay. They just may not pay anything. Period, right? They may just go and say, we'll try and recover. So it's not a great business model for the bad guys. The other thing to note is that, with this is in 2019, 22% really never got access to their data, but they haven't gotten better, because now they say only about 2% never get access back to their data. So that could be a server, a workstation, and there's different models that they do ransomware you with. Next. So this is a case study, and we were very lucky. This company is actually an accounting client of MNP. They suffered a ransomware attack, and we were able to help them a fair bit through this. But they were also gracious enough to let us kind of do a white paper and describe what happened. And quite honestly, it opened my eyes a little bit to hear about it from the recipient of a ransomware attack. We're always the helpers that come in afterwards, but to hear what an owner of a small company goes through and what his thoughts were during the event was very eye-opening. So the event didn't really start Monday morning. The event started Friday night when the owner of this organization tried to log into a server at his business. And it was a very small business, only about 5 employees that work there. And he couldn't get access to a server on Friday night. And he thought, well, it's just a connection problem, deal with it Monday. So he arrived on Monday morning and absolutely everything in his organization was locked. He had no phones because his phone was a VoIP system. It had been locked. He had no email. His workstation servers, all of his applications, everything was offline. And one of the things I kind of find funny, because I've been in the industry for well over 25 years and have had to live through the blue screens of death from Microsoft for a decade. In a lot of cases, when they bring up the ransomware screen, it actually looks like the blue screen of death from the Microsoft days. So it's definitely an attention getter when you see one of those. And then what also happened with this organization, they had one single IT support person that took care of their servers, their workstations, everything else. And ironically, this person was on the other side of the world on vacation. So it's still a question of whether their email had been compromised. They waited for the perfect timing to attack, knowing that this person had no IT support whatsoever, or if it was just coincidence. And then, as he stated, when he realized what had happened, his original thoughts were, "Is this the end of my business? Am I finished?" The second thought was, how am I going to lose my customers, and how many customers are I going to lose? And then kind of interestingly, the third thought that went through his mind was really the dollars, the cost. He was more concerned about his life, work going into this company and basically having it destroyed overnight. What happened after that is obviously, they contacted MNP to a general accountant. General accountant says, yeah, we have a few people that can help you. And our incident response team jumped in to help. And, when he started going through the payment and the recovery, he really started to understand how devastating this was to his organization. He was forced to pay $45,000 in Bitcoin. And this, as I mentioned, there's different scenarios that they use. In this case, they charged him per gigabyte of data that they had basically encrypted. So it was a pay per gig scenario instead of a pay per key, which the key would then unlock everything. There's different kind of things happening out there on the ransomware front. He said that by the time he got everything done, his computers were back up and running, that it basically cost him about $90,000 to mostly recover. He was, pretty well there. He found that it also took a very long time to unencrypt ransomware. So again, with ransomware, if it goes really deep in your computer and gets down to the bit level, which is the smallest level of data on a hard drive, if it goes that deep, it can actually take a week to 2 weeks to unencrypt an entire hard drive, depending, how much data is actually there. So it can take a long time to get back in business. And that also led to, the fact that his business was shut down for 5 full days. And during that time, he did lay off a couple of people because he didn't know if he was finished or not. But it took him about 1.5 weeks to fully get back online. Next slide. And so some of the challenges that he discussed was lack of documentation. So with his IT person missing, he realized he didn't have any diagrams, architecture, nothing about his current network. His workers, his workstations, his servers, everything. So it was very, very difficult to start recovery. It definitely affected his cash flow and his sales immediately because he's a small business. He couldn't be it really hurt to have no income coming in for like a week and a half. And as I mentioned, he did lay off workers temporarily. One of the things he talked about, which I don't normally think about, is the physical stress. So for the first 2 days, he basically said he wasn't able to sleep. He was just completely panicked and stressed. That led to him being what he called punch drunk, less able to actually respond clearly to the crisis. And he said it, what happened was once you do recover, there's really no downtime, because what happens is you got to get your feet back up under you, get running, but then you're behind by a week and a half in your work, so you've got to catch up. So there was that, business catch-up phase, and it took about 3 to 4 weeks for him to physically recover and start to feel actually normal and good again. His recommendations that came out of this were obviously evaluate your service provider, ask the right questions. So if you've got a single source, who's the backup if that person's not available? Or if that person's dealing with a crisis with another client, can they help you? He also said be proactive, look at your systems, make sure you're prepared, like you understand what you need to do, train your people, all of those kind of things. Use a well-known and experienced service provider. So again, using single resources is great, but you have to make sure that you have full coverage 24/7, because an attack like this can happen at any time. And then of course, in retro, he said, have somebody else that's in cyber or knowledgeable in IT come in and actually evaluate, what you're doing. Do you have proper backups? Do you have these kind of things all in place? Next. So that's kind of just a little bit of what ransomware looks like. It's still happening left, right, and center out there. We usually, within MNP, we have a new silo called MNP Digital, which is all of our IT security services, and one of our areas is incident response, led by a new partner in Vancouver. And unfortunately, since he started, I think he's had 2 events per week. To give you an idea, in the last 6 months. So it's just nonstop work trying to get companies, recovered, those kind of things. So talk a little bit about the future as well here. Next. This one's kind of interesting because, again, it's a social engineering attack. What's been happening, and you may have seen this lately, it was very recent in October 12th, but in Vancouver, this is happening quite a bit everywhere now. What they're doing is they're calling a person and basically saying, we're from the bank. Your bank account is basically at risk. We need you to move all of your money from your account to a secure account immediately because we think you're compromised. And unfortunately, they target the elderly, the people that wouldn't know better. And, in this case, this West Vancouver couple actually moved $500,000 from their account to a fake account, which was owned by the bad guys. And then the bad guys basically take that money out and disappear with it, go buy Bitcoin, and then you can't trace it because the Bitcoin's, very, very difficult to trace. So this again is a social engineering by phone, happens quite often. Next. This one we were actually chatting about before the session began, but this is very interesting because this was the first case that I know of where cyber criminals actually recorded a person's voice and then used artificial intelligence to recreate it. And once they did that, they actually were able to, get this company director in the UAE, steal his voice and then call people at his bank and basically say, hey, we need to move a bunch of account money. Please do this. And the person that on the other end of the phone at the actual bank had no idea this was a fake voice that was being created through AI. And they were actually able to steal $35 million. So this is kind of a very scary thing moving forward, because if you can't trust, the person's voice because it may be fake, that's becoming a real problem, especially with our move to remote, workers. This is definitely targeted at that environment. And we'll probably start to see more of this, because as soon as they see that an attack like this is successful, then organized crime, individuals will start to try to replicate this and steal more and more money. It's the reason that Nigerian scam about you've won, we're going to give you $1 million. It's successful because people still fall for this stuff, and it's all about education. So hopefully today is helping with that. Next slide. So for prevention, I'll really skip through just a couple of things here. The next. So there's actually 7 different areas that I would recommend in prevention. I won't talk about all of these, but obviously, as I stressed, training and awareness. Be aware of phishing attacks, ransomware. Don't pick up USB sticks in the parking lot, off the desk, plug them into a computer. Be aware of the people that are coming into your internal networks, your business areas, because social engineering is very much in your face. They are very good at this, and they can basically sweet talk anybody to get through the front door. The second thing is patching. Obviously, backups, number 3, very important, but follow a proper backup sequence. So offsite storage, don't leave the backup connected to a device. We see a lot of times small companies will buy a USB backup device, plug it into a computer, leave it there. Well, if ransomware hits that computer, it will jump right across to that USB hard drive and encrypt it also. So then you have no backups whatsoever. One of the key ones we find is most companies don't have a proper incident response. So when bad things happen, they don't know what to do, and it's a real challenge. Use of multi-factor authentication is really important. You're starting to see many organizations, whether it's, again, BC Hydro, Terrazin, the banks, you name it, they offer multi-factor authentication. I always recommend, if it's offered, use it, because it definitely suits the, definitely helps reduce risk. 6 is really maturity threat risk assessments. So those are having a third party come in and do a 360 review of your organization, looking at where your critical data, your critical assets are, and how you protect them. And then obviously there's cyber insurance too. Next. So talk a little bit about training and awareness. So with this one, again, the users are your weakest link, and I just keep saying that over and over and over, because we find like so many breaches just end up being something either accidentally done by an employee, or they do something that they know they shouldn't have, but they did anyway. So if you develop a training program, the 2 key things there are, it has to have leadership involvement. So, if you don't have leadership buying in and promoting it, it's usually a challenge to make the emphasis on the employee stick. And then also develop personalized training plans. So not every person in an organization needs to have the same training. Somebody, it's like a DBA in an organization that takes care of databases. They may need specific training to what they do versus somebody that is say a teller at a bank. Very different. And training should include those 4 things again, obviously at the bottom: how to recognize phishing emails, how to create and maintain strong passwords, don't use dangerous applications. I always laugh when I look at small hotels and I go in and I see things like World of Tanks, or any of these games installed on front office computers, because quite frankly, the night auditor's finished his work by 3 and he plays games till 4. But we see a lot of things like loaded on the computers that shouldn't be there. Next. Patching is basically what happens next. So if you can, if you're attacking an organization, the first thing that an attacker, a penetration tester, these people will do is they will go look for those missing vulnerabilities, or missing patches, because those are vulnerabilities. And even though a patch 3 years ago may have been rated as a very minor patch, with changes in technology, that minor patch over 3 years could have became a critical flaw, and then that could be utilized by a bad threat actor. Again, Apple issued this one just recently in September 13th that most people are probably aware of, that said, update your iPhones. But quite honestly, this was iPhones, it was iPads, it was iMacs, and it was also Apple TVs, because the same vulnerability could be loaded to any of those devices. And what this particular malware allowed them to do is hear everything on the phone, whether you're in a phone conversation or not. And it also allowed them to access the camera, so they could actually watch everything you're doing, even though you're not on a phone call or anything else. So again, if you haven't patched all your Apple devices, great idea to go do that as quickly as possible. Next. And we kind of talked about that single resource, but again, not having information about your infrastructure, that's your first big mistake. If you don't have that documented, make a model, serial numbers of workstation servers, what applications are running on them, what operating system, what version, all of those things are really important. And that's what we call your asset inventory. And without knowing your pieces in your environment, it's very hard to protect the entire environment. So again, with smaller companies, if you've only got single resources, you can look to managed services providers to do things like manage your firewall, manage your patching, these kind of things. But it definitely, is a direction you can go. But having an unmatched system is basically unmanaged system is basically 100% guarantee that you're going to have problems. Next. Again, maturity threat risk assessments. Next. Again, this is really just a 360 review, as I mentioned. So when we do these kind of things, they're based on what was originally called the SANS 21 critical controls. So they do a 360 on your organization. They look at your policies, your processes, physical security, technology security, your HR, everything. It's basically a complete review. The reason you do that is it will identify your highest critical risks, and that allows you to basically spend your time and resources, i.e. money, on the things that will give you the biggest bang for the buck, essentially. What's going to help you the most, where you put those resources. So it's definitely a first step for mid-sized organizations if they're not sure of what their risks actually are. Next. Have a plan. As I mentioned, incident response, we get called a lot, with MNP within the accounting, and usually the question goes, do you have all of the information from our last audit, like our accounts receivable ledger, accounts payable ledger? And when we get those calls, they usually let me know, because I'm pretty sure that's been a cyber attack with ransomware, and the company's trying to rebuild everything without having to pay the ransom. So we do see that a lot. Incident response plan should definitely be, have people identified who is, the speaker, who's the communications person within the organization. When I worked with the BC government 10 years ago with our payment card compliance, we had a parking meter stolen outside of Goldstream here in Victoria. And unfortunately, a news reporter found out about it. He went to 3 different people in government at different levels, and he got 3 different answers about whether credit card data was stolen, whether it had been stored, all of these kind of things. So, again, it can go really wrong for an organization if you don't develop a communications plan and who's going to speak to an event. Just as an aside there, really quickly, that was the year that parking at all provincial parks was free, because they realized they had a problem with hard drives on all these parking kiosks, so they replaced them all that year, but they couldn't get them until next year, so that's why we had free parking a number of years ago. Next. And then multi-factor authentication, again, I mentioned this, we can kind of jump on this one. Next. Again, there's different ways for multi-factor authentication. The normal is usually it sends a confirmation to your phone, and then you accept it, and that allows you into the either website or the building or whatever. Next. Cyber insurance is always an interesting question. Next. it all comes down to really what your risk is, and your risk threshold, and that really determines whether you need it or you don't need it. But what I am finding is that, especially with payment card compliance, which is PCI, if you're not compliant with the PCI standard, a lot of organizations now are being denied cyber insurance because they're not following best practices just on protected credit cards. So it is important that, you do look at how much you need, and it really depends on your risk appetite. And there's different companies that offer, different coverages. It is getting much more difficult to actually get to. Next. So this is just my last slide here. I always put this in there because if you don't know who Kevin Mitnick is, he's recognized as the world's most famous hacker. But as you can see clearly from his shirt, he says, "I'm not a hacker." And I actually met him at Vancouver when I believe it was, we brought him in for a conference and he spoke, about cyber. And what was interesting about Kevin is that he never hacked into a system ever. He spent years and years in prison. This is the guy that they wouldn't let him use a phone in the prison because they were worried he could phone a phone line, whistle tones, and set off a nuclear war, because he was at, the predominant stages, 15 years ago when cyber hacking, was happening. But he never ever hacked into a computer system. He actually asked people and they gave him passwords and they gave him access. And then once he was actually granted access to the environments, that's when he did his hacking and, copied, stole things, changed data, all of these kind of things. But it's actually, again, goes back to your people are your number one line of defense. And this is how he always broke into a company, through that first line of defense. So next. So that's the overall presentation today. We can easily go for hours and talk about all the different types of attacks that are going on, because as I mentioned, we see everything happening these days. USB, key drops is kind of key, all of those kind of things. So great. Back to you.
Great, thank you, Ron. My name is Bill Sherrod. I'm the Director of Community Business and Real Estate with Van City. And just want to thank everyone for attending today's session. We will get into some questions and answers shortly. There is a QR code on your screen. I'm sure we're all familiar with it now with the vaccine cards we need. But if you could take a moment and just scan, there's a short survey, very short survey, just to get your insights on future seminars and on today's webinar in particular. And there are 3 gift cards that will be given out for $100 each for anyone that's going into the draw. But no, thank you, Ron. Very insightful presentation today. And I think in today's cyber world we're living in, very relevant. So I'm going to just jump right into questions, just in the essence of time. First question is, will we have access to the slide deck? And yes, we will. All participants will be receiving an email the next day or 2 with the recording of the presentation, including the slides and obviously Ron's commentary that goes with it, which will be great. The next question I have is for Ron. Are there any specific days in which our employees are most likely to fall prey to email scams, like a Monday or a Thursday? And if and when that happens, what are specific information that is given away, such as passwords? Does it happen for new employees versus long-term employees? So it's kind of a 3-part question there. And you're on mute, Ron.
That's a great question, and it definitely has a long answer if I go into each of them. I'll give you an example. There's a university in Alberta that they targeted with the old, fake bill scam. So what happened is they usually try to attack people end of day, especially on a Friday, because people want to get things done, want to leave, want to get on with their weekend. So in this case, they basically attacked this university accounts payable. They spearphished the person, knew who to go to. They did the research. They found out that, a lot of construction was happening at this university. They found out who had won the public tenders because it's public. It was all public. You could research and find that information. They sent an email to this person stating that we're such and such company. We have these contracts. We've changed our banking information. Please change, our banking info in your records. And this woman, in a hurry to get out of there on a Friday, did just that. And immediately they were hit with, I believe, about a $2 million invoice from the fake company. A fake invoice. The company, university, paid that. So there's $2 million gone. They waited about a week. They sent another invoice. I think it was for about $10,000. The university paid that, and then they decided to go for the Grand Slam, and they sent an invoice for 9.1 million, and the university actually paid that as well. So they lost over $12.4 million because one employee changed bank information without double checking it and fell for a phishing email. So it can kind of show you the disaster that can happen. So that's kind of a good example of where, unfortunately, phishing, those kind of attacks happen. So I would say, a lot of the time it's late in the day, or it's, a Friday afternoon, or best even before long weekends, because then people are really trying to get out there without doing any additional checks.
Great, thanks. Next question. What's your thoughts on third-party password providers and specifically on the Norton Password Manager?
They're all good to a certain extent. It goes all the way back to your browsers, whether you're trusting, your Google browser to store your password for you. That's one area they're stored. I never do that personally, just because I don't trust all those platforms, but I do use, personally, I use 1Password, and there's a reason for that. One is that, I must have 50 to 60 different passwords I have to keep for different systems, encrypted files, all of these kind of things. And by using a product like 1Password, I can create multiple, entities, and I can assign a different password to each, and I don't have to remember them. I can basically use the app to generate a complex, very difficult password and then store it. So I don't need to, write them down, forget them, all of those kind of things. So definitely beneficial. If you've got a lot of different accounts, even personally, I would use a product like that. And most of them are fairly reasonable, if not free. But use a reputable one like Norton's or 1Password, those kind of applications.
Great, thanks, Ron. We've only got time for one more question. We want to wrap up right at 1 for everybody. If there's one thing small business owners, that's primarily who's on the call today, can do, what's one thing they can start doing today, tomorrow, to get the ball rolling to help protect their small business through this cyber world?
So I actually think it's a tie. So obviously, as throughout the theme of this presentation, it's educate your employees, because they're basically leading to the majority of the successful attacks. If employees aren't trained, especially around email, social engineering, that's a major problem. I would tie that with the second thing being, know what your critical data is, and how you store it, who has access to it. So know where the crown jewels are. It's pretty amazing that people know where it is, but they don't realize people made copies of it and moved it around. So, you may have a database with confidential data, and a DBA may have done a query that copied that data, but then kept it on another workstation. And it's outside of where you knew it should be. And those are kind of like out of bounds storage. That can be a real problem, because information can then float, can be put into email, sent out. So knowing where the critical assets are, critical pieces of information, what can stop your business cold if that information gets breached, that's the second thing I would really pay attention to. Understand your environment.
Great, thank you, Ron. Well, on behalf of Ron from MNP and from all of us at Van City, we would like to thank all of our business members for attending today's webinar. It is right at 1 o'clock, so we do want to respect your time, and I wish you all the best, and enjoy a beautiful sunny day in Vancouver. It is nice to see. So again, we will have the webinar recording sent out by email over the next day or two if you want to follow up with any of the information that Ron spoke about. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Great, thank you.